So, I've watched Sargon of Akkad on and off for years, just kind of here and there, really since the earlier days of YouTube, mid 2010s, when he was known kind of for essentially being kind of, well, like a classical liberal political YouTuber. He would make and engage in argumentation, debates, video essays from an ideologically kind of centrist liberal position. Sort of like, coming from the centre ground basically, and position himself as like a voice of reason, in the wilderness of, that is the YouTuberama sort of videoscape. I've always kind of liked him, admittedly. I find him very sort of amiable, kind of amenable, just a personable, reasonable guy. I think his videos are at least always kind of somewhat engaging and interesting, and he had, strong liberal principles from which he was able to kind of easily engage with people, whether they be, friends or his political opponents. And of course, to an extent, he still is all those things, but he has quite noticeably changed over the years. Which isn't to say like I'm implying that he's worsened or anything, but of course everyone kind of changes, over the span of their lives. But I think Sargon's evolution is particularly of interest, over the eons and the ages of YouTube history. And I wanted to discuss that a bit. So I feel like, at least from what I remember, and this is going back years, probably like a decade or so ago, was that kind of criticism, argumentation with Sargon, it was kind of becoming more voluble and noticeable, and his channel kind of subsequently was gaining more and more traction. I suppose that just kind of comes with being a political YouTuber. You're inevitably going to be somewhat polarizing depending on the perspective of the viewer. And being sort of a centrist, Sargon would attract negative attention on kind of both sides of the aisle. You might remember that the kind of the horseshoe theory, stuff like popularized by liberal YouTubers. They like to kind of semi-pathologize like both right and left wing opinions. They end up being they end up being kind of circular and end up at the same kind of authoritarian outcome, which, to be fair, at least superficially, kind of certain merit there. But in any case, it was how I initially kind of came across Sargon, whether it was via some kind of either pro or anti-Sargon meme or whatever. Actually, it's how I discovered kind of both Millennial Woes and Computer Forever. I remember Woes had a formal debate with Sargon about white nationalism, and Computer Forever, I think, inadvertently sparked. Do you remember the kind of the Marxist Sargonism meme? Was it Marxist Sargonism? Basically, Sargon viewed from the right, so looks like a leftist, and that Sargon himself kind of became manifest, a sort of mimetic product of the internet, Sargonism. Not that particular meme really took off, but looking back, it's kind of funny. But yeah, Sargon essentially became very influential on YouTube, social media in general. But I feel like as time went by, this kind of mimesis, so to speak, these kind of constant noises that swirled around him, I feel like kind of affected him in that social media in general, the past 10 years or so, has quite radically polarized. If you used to lean on the left, you went further leftwards. On the other hand, if you had some character and moral conviction in any way whatsoever, then you kind of leaned to the right and you went further rightwards. Sargon being this kind of mimetic center, this classical liberalism, I think ultimately started to get pulled rightwards and being pushed from the left. So from Marxist Sargonism over to the right, in a weird way, it's like kind of his own weird mimetic internal, like political horseshoe from Marxist now to trad Sargonism, if there's such a thing. But I digress. On the way, I think throughout my kind of intermittent viewership of Sargon, I remember he started his liberalist campaign eventually, and I can't for the life of me recall what it was about. Apart from I remember kind of Starship Troopers being invoked. I can't remember if that was kind of semi-ironic or, well, it doesn't matter because it didn't gain much traction at the time. But I think because after that, he at some point became he became more political. He got involved with UKIP. He joined the party, and I think did he run for member? I don't know what he did, but it goes to show that, again, this kind of IRL political stance and posturing, he's shifting rightwards. It's kind of reifying his kind of political ideation as being to the right now by taking this sort of stance. And being in the real world kind of came with real world fallout and pushback. I mean, remember Sargon getting kippered at some kind of UKIP event, and I think it was like an old lady that threw a kipper at him. Also, there was an instance where he made an off-colour, so to speak, sex joke about Jess Phillips that maybe retrospectively wasn't made in the best of taste, but unfortunately, an offhand sort of casual joke, it went viral and it was used against him in his UKIP campaigning, which politically, IRL, it did hurt him. And fast forward to now, he's not as visible politically outside of the internet, but if anything, he's kind of shifted further to the right, like with the Lotus Eaters. His new brand of political commentary that really comes from a sort of overt right-wing perspective, and not just in the sense that 20 years ago, like UKIP would have been as the political centre, but as in Sargon himself, kind of referring to himself as an English traditionalist, and I believe I heard him say that at times. And some of his rhetoric, it's not like belligerent or anything, but he does touch a lot more about the English having sort of innate value as a people. So kind of defining Englishness not just as some kind of flimsy, sort of meaningless cultural trope or phenomena, but that can be copy pasted onto other peoples. That's endlessly interchangeable. Think of like modern day conservative ideology, essentially, but that we, the English, are a defined, or rather a potentially definable ethnic group with our own political interests. Now, that really is a kind of politically correct way of saying stuff the alternative right used to say back in the day, although, to be honest, they would more explicitly, or for the most part, define Englishness in terms of race, or perhaps kind of more subtly in terms of ethnicity. It's not just about culture, but that the English are a coherent group of people that have their own rights and interests, and that they should be fairly represented politically, and dare I say it, have a right to a homeland, which is just obviously England. It's not really all that complicated, but it does represent, in my opinion at least, a very marked shift from his kind of classical enlightened centrist phase to where he is now, which is like really full-on repatriation, or at least to illegal immigrants, a complete halt to immigration as well. Like, he has noticeably shifted over quite far to the right, hard right, basically. And again, to say this is very sort of reflective of YouTube social media trends of polarization over the years. But now we've kind of caught up with Sargon, to the point of the title of the video. What now, and what happens to the Lotus Eaters? Because really the Lotus Eaters have, in my opinion, kind of become a sort of like almost like the alt-right 3.0, since the old guard are mostly gone, with the exception of like a few stalwarts like Morgoth and so on. The alt-right 2.0 being, for me, the kind of Twitter like rightist cultural diaspora, which I won't go into because it's like groups and refractions of like meta, like autistic hyper reality, and we just won't go there because it just ends up a mess. But there's also sort of like Nick Fuentes and the Groypers, which you've probably heard of, being kind of the alt-right 2.0. You know, they they kind of became the ideological meta center of the alternative alt-right post Charlottesville. It's all kind of confusingly meta, isn't it? But now I feel like, yeah, the alt-right 3.0, there's like this, it's manifest as this kind of British awakening. You know, really formally disaffected liberals and alt-right figures that have swayed more and more into the kind of the hard line right to an extent. Like the Lotus regularly do appear on Millennial and pretty much agree on everything. You know, maybe not everything, but in large part, they're all very agreeable with the kind of larger millennial scene and audience. And really, this would have been unimaginable several years ago, in my opinion. You know, it would have just been laughed at. You know, the old days of Sargon, the enlightened centrists, classical liberalism, really, you know, a joke to the denizens of, you know, the old Big Tent, the alt right. But now everyone's kind of mates, so yeah, things have definitely changed. Like the disaffected liberals are now like sharing a barbecue in the rightist camp. But the big question: where does it go now? The fate of Sargon and the Lotus Eaters. I feel like either they keep moving right, or at least, you know, they are perceived as shifting, you know, too far outside of the Overton window, and they either get banned or deplatformed, or maybe just shadow banned at best, or they'll be portrayed in mainstream media as just far right, basically, sort of white nationalist adjacent. Because the problem is there's every reason to think they will keep shifting to the right because they are subject to an algorithmically shifting Overton window and a polarizing political landscape, and they might find themselves sort of just getting dealt with by the powers that be eventually, you know, by the chthonic tendrils of the, you know, the globalist hydra, and just getting crushed. Just specifically going back to Sargon, like this English traditionalism, you've really got to try to define that in some way, because traditionalism has many different connotations and intellectual currents. So, what exactly does Sargon mean by that when he says it? Here's a challenge: define it without sounding like just a bloody conservative, you know, like trad conservatism, or whatever. At some point, you've got to break out of that kind of hard right, but ultimately sort of liberal mold that you're still kind of comfortably ensconced in. If you keep inexorably shifting to the right, surely that's got to happen at some point. You've got to break out of that. And also, you can't protect politically that which you can't define politically. How do you protect like feeling English with a vote or with politics? It's really difficult. I mean, feeling English, being part of an English tradition, that's obviously great. But then you go down the political route. Like, now what? Because the enemy has all the power and all the guns and all the weapons, physically and rhetorically, all the media on the side. They just call you all these, you know, the magic words, you know, racist, sexist, homophobic, anti-Semite, and then you've been marked as, you know, untouchable within the well-to-do classes, and you can't get a job and certainly not a career. You know, even worse, you might find yourself sort of permanently just deplatformed, you know, from social media and the digital public sphere, as has happened to a lot of people that just slightly cross the line of what's considered acceptable speech. Which, who knows what that is nowadays? It's, you know, don't even try, you know, bother trying to define or fathom what, you know, non-hate crime, hate speech incidents are. It's impossible, you know. And also, Sargon being at heart a liberal, you know, really can't go all the way on this, because he'll just end up sounding like the people he used to hate, you know, like basically white nationalists. You know. Ironically, he could become the thing eventually that he wants to shoot if he keeps shifting to the right. And if he does the other thing and avoids, you know, that by just sort of going as far as saying, we're English traditionalists and that's where we are now, and we stand up for the English, well, the left already know how to pick that apart. They'll call you out for not exactly defining your beliefs. And if you do try to, well, racist off to the gallows you go, right? Be gone, devil, permaban, deplatformed, unpersoned. And all this I'm saying from the point of view that, I like Sargon and the Lotus Eaters, but ultimately they can only go so far with within their political parameters. They have to toe the line. And possibly that's the same with the new party Restore, but that's another video in the future. So yeah, I just feel like where Sargon and Lotus Eaters end up, they either just kind of eventually sort of become irrelevant because they have to kind of stay somewhat politically anodyne, because the Overton window just keeps moving, it keeps polarizing, it keeps shifting. But if they stay where they are, they just become irrelevant eventually. Or they do kind of shift with the Overton window. They leave liberal doctrine. Maybe they become, they become more interesting. Funnily enough, they become more rambunctious. Maybe they can rally the masses to an extent, become a pulpit for mass repatriation in a way that's palatable for mainstream media. They become vocal, influential Restore supporters, or they just get targeted by the regime and they get banned. It's a difficult line they've got to stray. And if they get banned, they have to then reinvent themselves, as Sargon has done, and make himself algorithmically kind of palatable to YouTube again somehow. So yeah, there's just some thoughts on Sargon, the Lotus Eaters, how they've kind of meshed with the remains of the old alternative right and where they end up. But I do like them. I think they're quite entertaining. So hopefully they don't get ban hammered anytime soon. But if they do stay on YouTube, I think it'd be interesting to see if they keep evolving. Do they keep shifting to the right and see where they end up? They could end up being somewhat interesting eventually. And hopefully they can avoid trouble. But one last thing I would say, if you've politically shifted over the years, like Sargon, sort of along with the tide, instead of just kind of shifting momentarily, why not just kind of go to the end destination, so to speak, straight away? If you're in the same kind of disaffected liberal position as Sargon, Lotus Eaters, and a lot of other, a lot of people just generally, maybe just stop and evaluate, just everything, not just your politics, but your perspective on just reality, like everything that you've been told growing up and through the institutions and media, how they've just kind of, I wouldn't say as strong as brainwashed, but informed and somewhat dictated your worldview. Maybe just sort of reevaluate everything, and then eventually, just maybe, you finally get to see what we've all been seeing all along. So with that, I'll say see you in the next video.